Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room, an island show that delivers whenever and however we can. I'm Robin Adair, back from my, I think, well-deserved holiday in sunny Mexico, where it was very warm. And speaking of warm, things got actually hot here in the Rumble Room while I was away. John Jurisic had some special guests on the show, duking it out last week, and Johnny, it seemed like you hardly missed a beat.
Hey, welcome back, Robin. Welcome back to sort of sunny Victoria. Yeah, it was so much fun with Ryan and Mark. Ryan, of course, has a successful podcast himself, so very easy to talk to him. He was co-host. Mark McDonald from the Business Examiner. We got into all kinds of chatting, a lot of it around election stuff. And turns out it was our highest rated show ever.
Well, isn't that a compliment to us, John? All we needed was Ryan Painter, and now we have our highest rated show.
No,
Makes me feel like I should never have come back from my holiday.
Oh, I'm teasing you. That was fun. I'll tell you what was interesting, and this is from Mark McDonald's side. There are Trump sympathizers in Canada. I mean, I hate Trump. Okay? I am embarrassed to talk about Trump. Yet there are sympathizers. Oh my God, I would rumble with those guys. I would like to see you rumble with those guys any day of the week.
Well, there's lots to rumble about because Trump just makes it so easy. I mean, he isn't even in office yet, and he's already talking about big threats towards Canada, wants to make us the 51st state, stirring the pot. And little Justin Trudeau, he flies down immediately to Mar-a-Lago in Florida to try to calm the waters. And it did not go well by all accounts. Trump tells a gathering that Canada needs to meet its military obligations of reaching 2% spending for its annual budget on security. He goes on to say we have a huge deficit that's outstanding in our trade, and he wants that fixed. He wants illegal immigration to stop from Canada, illegal drugs to stop from Canada. He's threatening a 25% tariff on Canadian goods. Trudeau says, well, that's going to be terrible for our economy. And Trump's big counter to that is Canada can become the 51st state. I mean, Johnny, it can't get much worse than that. Your reaction?
Well, I got reactions. You just heard how I feel about Trump. Bully. And Canada somehow needs to have a better response than our Prime Minister flying down to his Mar-a-Lago estate. Made me want to puke seeing our PM sitting beside this guy. And then they show an expanded shot with all these Trumpites sitting beside him. No, I don't want Canada represented at that table. And don't even go to where there's a 51st state. I'm an old guy, but I would damn well fight if that ever became remotely close to being anything like reality. There are tough negotiations going on with the states. And I really worry that Justin Trudeau isn't up to the task. He is not up to the task.
No, I know there's people despair about Pierre Poilievre. I talk to people all the time. Well, I don't like Pierre Poilievre, but believe me, we need a change in this country. It's time for others to take control of the levers of the Canadian economy, which is laying flatlining, and we need better leadership. We need people who can stand up to Donald Trump and be on the world stage.
Like that Mexican leader. She stood up to him.
Well, she stood up to Canada. She stood up to Canada because Trudeau's talking about negotiating separately, and then she got into, well, Mexico has 1,000 years of history and culture. What does Canada have?
Right.
You know, and here's
Trudeau see her at that table with
Trudeau saying that Canada, in fact, is a post-culture. We don't have our own culture. This is Trudeau, the leader of the country. So it just drives you crazy. And, you know, it is time for an election, John. There's no two ways about it. And, there's other things going on right now. We just seen the collapse of the Assad government in Syria. And this has all just happened so quickly. Bad news for Russia, bad news for Iran, which has always been able to shift weapons through Syria into places like Hezbollah and Hamas. So where that goes with the war with Israel, I guess the jury's still out. Lots of questions around that, and we'll talk more about that in another show.
Yeah,
but let's shift back now. let's shift back down to BC politics. We got, David Eby giving everybody in his caucus except one a big promotion with lots more money. And I think even the one's going to become chair of a bunch of committees. So they're lining their pockets. They haven't done a thing yet. And their biggest priority should be, instead of lining their own pockets, doing something about the welfare of the economy of the province. And it shouldn't be new job creation all relying on government. I believe 1 in 5 of the new jobs created in BC at the moment is in the private sector. The rest of it's all public sector money, and the debt going up and up. And they've got to do something about changing this. The clock is ticking. They've got to change their priorities. If David Eby wants to remain the premier and the NDP wants to remain in power, they've got to get back to fixing the economy. It's the number one priority, not all this other woke stuff that they're so in love with.
Yeah. I think even the servers in the legislative restaurant got portfolios. Pathetic. Like, you could probably walk in there, who knows what the minister or parliamentary secretary of anything is. That's just so indicative of this government. Private sector growth historically is what drives economic development and what drives prosperity. Of course, we need government jobs to help keep us all together and to help the less fortunate, but that's funded by private sector business growth. And we did see some of that happening in past Liberal and social credit governments. Why don't you borrow a bit of that? The election certainly said that you should recognize that. So, come on. And guess what? Why don't they call on a guest of ours, former Deputy Premier and longtime solicitor Rich Coleman, for some fresh ideas?
They could do worse. They could do worse than picking up the phone with a guy like Rich Coleman and saying, hey, we've got some problems. What do you think? But I don't think that's going to happen.
No,
and, another former MLA and a guest we had on this show just about a month ago was Judy Tyabji. And she has written yet another book, and it's called That's Rich, The Rise and Fall of the BC Liberals. It's all about Rich Coleman. And Judy is back with us. She's back to talk about her book, and she's back to talk about Rich. So let's zoom her in. And now we welcome back to the Victoria Rumble Room once again, Judy Tyabji, the former BC Liberal, I would say almost like a political maverick at one time, who is now an author who's written about BC history. She's written about Glenn Clark, Christy Clark, and now That's Rich, the story of Rich Coleman. That's Rich, the rise and fall of the BC Liberals. And Judy, it's just great to have you on the program.
Very nice to be on the show.
Well, we love to dig into this stuff. And personally, I feel I lived a lot of this. So it's kind of fun to be able to relive it in your book, which I have to say I really enjoyed. And
Thank you.
It's the life and times of somebody who was the former deputy premier of the province, was a key in the BC Liberal dynasty that went on for 16 years, a very long political record in British Columbia. But I was never under the impression, Judy, that you and Rich were all that close back in the legislative days. So how did you happen to become his author, write his biography?
Well, I tried not to be. It's a funny thing because this is my fourth. I'll show you. Shameless promotion, of course, it's backwards, but my fourth book on BC politics. And if anyone had told me that I would become the most prolific author of BC political books, I'd be like, no, this is crazy. But the first one was because of the rise of the Liberals, 1987 to 1994, basically, and then when I watched, I had a front row seat to Glenn Clark being more or less taken out by his own attorney general and the forces that were going on behind the scenes in the NDP. And then Christy Clark re-engaging. I basically was just a sheep farmer for 10, 12 years. And then when Christy became leader of the Liberals, and I was watching what was going on in social media, because social media just started to have this giant presence in BC politics, it really bothered me because, I can handle democracy being about two people disagreeing and people, putting their vote a certain way, but I don't like being manipulated and I don't like dishonesty. And there was so much of that going on that led to the book about Christy Clark, which I think really changed the conversation. And certainly at one point she said it helped her win the 2017 election, although she lost majority by 150 votes in Comox. So still makes her the most successful female politician in Canadian history, winning 2 elections. But then Rich, I mean, he contacted me after some of the testimony in the Cullen Commission, and was right after the COVID year. And I've been working on a business project that's been keeping me busy. And suddenly I get this email from Rich Coleman, whom I didn't even like him, didn't know him. Had interviewed him once for the Christy Clark book, thought he was Pop's ass. And, I'll still tell him that. There's nothing I'm not going to say to his face, obviously.
He'd laugh about that, though.
He would laugh about that. And, honestly, I think he was trying really hard to be like the arrogant wall of man for the Liberals for all those years, to try to push back all the critics. But he was really persistent about wanting to work with me on a book. And I was so sure, based on what I thought I knew about him, that after a couple of interviews, he'd be like, this is a very opinionated ethnic woman. What was I thinking? And he'd walk away. But it actually went the other way. After the second interview, I got really mad at him. And I'm like, okay, how is it possible that your public image is the opposite of you? Like, now I'm pissed off. And he was like, I need therapy after these interviews. But yeah, Rich is a very loyal, hardworking, outcome-oriented guy who, if he's given a task, will just keep going till he gets it done. And he's 100% motivated for all the corny reasons of making the world a better place, and showing up for his community, and standing up for his fellow politicians. Like, he truly is motivated by the right things, which made the public narrative about him so bizarre to me, except that what it meant was that the people who could have protected him threw him under the bus and said, yeah, sure, let him take all the blame for all our bad decisions. And he kept going anyway. So when you get to the back of the book, and I never did this in any other book, but there's actually, I think, 10 pages, like the cabinet responsibilities section. I had to add it because every cabinet shuffle, he got more responsibilities until he was, the most heavily weighted cabinet minister in BC history. And he was also the deputy premier. So yeah, it was
Judy,
very interesting.
I want to ask you a question you've literally just answered, but I want to go through it again because
you answered so many questions in that response.
Because I felt the same way about Rich Coleman. I was involved. Yeah. Robin and I were both involved with the chamber during the 2000s. That meant we chatted with cabinet ministers. That meant we ended up chatting with Rich Coleman. Scared the bejesus out of me. He was the only guy that I was like scared to go into his office. Anyway, here's the context of the question. So there's so much detail in your book, and such an excellent overview of BC history, from our colonial history to the rise of social credit, the emergence of Rich Coleman on the political landscape. He comes across in the book as an everyday man from a small town who wanted to build a better province to the best of his ability. What a guy! Is that really now the fair way to see him?
It is. So what's the worst thing you can say about him is that he was way too trusting of people who used him for their own advantage. And that's where I got to by about the 4th interview. And a lot of people, I think that the reason the NDP targeted him is if they took out Christy Clark and he became the leader, he would have won the election for the BC Liberals. So they had tarnished her enough. It's like, that's not enough. We got to get that guy because he's loyal to her and he's holding all those cabinet responsibilities anyway. And he would have been the face of the Conservatives. And I'll tell you another thing that would have been kind of interesting. I wonder what would have happened if Rich Coleman was the leader of the BC Conservatives instead of John Rustad. I don't know. I mean, he was the most successful fundraiser in BC history, political fundraiser. And not just political, I mean, he's raised money for mental health issues for first responders. And that's where I've ended up working with him on a project with one of the guys I interviewed for the book, which if you both read it, and thank you for your comment about the history. I really enjoyed going all the way back in time and pulling forward our context.
Well, Amor de Cosmos. You got into all the real detail stuff. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. All the colorful guys. Yeah. Anyway.
It's interesting that Rich Coleman, he was the party whip and House Leader when they were in opposition. Then he was a cabinet minister. He took on so many different mantles, not the Attorney General, but a lot of others, housing and oversight for or the LNG project. But he also was tagged. He was also tagged because of what happened around the casinos and accusations that money was from offshore was illegally being funneled through casinos and it was going into the housing market, thus driving up the price of homes, particularly in places like Vancouver. And he was seen as somebody who at best was not doing his job and at worst was actually part of the problem, to the point that the NDP, when they came in power, set up a commission to investigate this. So this must have been a real sting to the end of a very long, hard-working career to have to face all of that.
Well, and I think that really, without that, there wouldn't have been a book about him. And I often say that's the silver lining. You go through something that is that awful when you feel like you've given province your all and you're made out to be this giant criminal and you're a former RCMP officer. How does that, jive with you? I think he's too humble a person to have ever wanted to collaborate on a book without that driving thing of, oh my gosh, I don't want people to think that I was this person.
And yet
So
the
I have
criminal
to.
report said there was no evidence of wrongdoing. It's not as
That's the thing.
publicized as all the accusations.
That's right. That's right. And I mean, there are many, many things about even all the German reports where, in politics, you are often defined by your enemies, right? So they took the things that served their spin and they spun them. And I still believe that the communications team for the BC Liberals didn't protect Rich. I don't think they really thought it was a problem if he took, carried the can for this. And I think that they thought if we just keep doing our job, people will see we're doing a good job and we'll get reelected. And it's that almost that hubris, that inertia. Like, we're this great government. Why do we don't have to listen to those guys? Who cares what they're saying? They're full of garbage. It's like, no, you need to respond to that or it's going to stick. And anyway, I mean, those are the lessons that one would hope that they'd learn. And sometimes parties just get to that point where they need renewal. And that's why you went from the BC Liberals to United to they're just gone now,
To nothing.
And I named the book The Rise and Fall of the BC Liberals, knowing that, I told Rich in January after I finished the research and I saw how the Conservative Party ended up running under this unionist banner and then disappearing, and they had never been in government again. And the Liberals rose up for a while, and then the Socrats. So when I went through them, I'm like, you know what? It's the Conservatives' turn. This United Party is going to be gone. And I told him, they said, they're not going to be in the election. They're going to be gone. He's like, it'll never happen. And you can even, next time you interview him, you can say, Judy said, I told you so. And I did.
Judy,
Wow.
It's the way it goes,
He'll be watching this for sure.
Yeah.
We've had him on for several times, and each time I'm waiting for Rich Coleman, public persona, to come on. So I'm like, well, and he's this nice guy, and he's very balanced. He's humorous. He's sort of just kind of person you talk to in the pub. Oh my gosh. Anyway, he said the current housing crisis didn't have to happen. NDP accused the Liberals of allowing foreign investors to ratchet up housing prices. But Rich said he had a successful affordable housing program in place with municipalities. Do you think your accounting in the book has now set the record straight on this issue?
Well, I think this book and even the one with Christy Clark, that when I interviewed Rich Coleman about the housing thing, the NDP had started to put that narrative of the housing crisis at the feet of the Liberals then. And he described his model, and I outlined it in that book. And in addition, the BC model was so successful that throughout North America, the housing ministers were coming in to adopt that model. So really, like so many things in government, it's like a tugboat. It takes a long time to change direction, and they changed the direction. If they just stayed the course, I think we would have had a lot more positive impact. But the NDP, as soon as they came in, they dismantled it. And it was kind of funny going back to your point of you were waiting for that sort of public persona to show up.
Mm-hmm.
One of my biggest challenges in the book was trying to find somebody who would say what most members of the public would say to Rich's face and see what he would say. So I'd just be curious. You know who I'm talking about, I think. The one person who went right over is the firefighter. And he was prepared to articulate all of those things, that the housing crisis and the bags of cash from which, David Eby raised in the leaders debate in the last election as well, this whole idea of hockey bags of cash. And Rich did a really good job of answering it.
It's interesting, all the other files. I want to talk for a minute about LNG, and
Yeah.
we'll take it back again because you are a historian of BC politics. You'll remember, as I do, that in fact, one of the guys who really got natural gas going up in the Northeast was, in fact, Dan Miller under the
Right.
Harcourt government. He was somebody who
Right.
really pushed for that. There were lots of people in that NDP caucus who didn't like the idea, but he was from the North himself. He was I believe he was a terrorist guy, and he
Yeah.
said, "No, we've got to do something about getting more industry in this province. It can't just all be forestry. It can't all be mining, and gas and oil would really have a very positive effect on the economy." And he pushed for that. And then it's interesting that the baton, in a way, got passed on. Rich Coleman got involved in it in a very big way, and he was one of the guys behind the pipeline and getting $40 billion
Yeah.
of public investment into that pipeline, and huge controversy around that. And I don't know that he or Dan Miller get the credit for all the hard work that they did in terms of ensuring that that got built.
Well, so Dan Miller was really focused on offshore drilling. And to me, you're right. The good news about Dan Miller is he was a real advocate for rural and remote British Columbia, because a lot of people don't realize our wealth comes from our primary sector, which is in the north, on the north coast, in the interior, in the Kootenays. Historically, it's been forestry, mining. We used to have fisheries till we kind of fished them out, and then all the licenses got stacked, et cetera, et cetera. But going back to, so Dan Miller was really good about that. But the NDP's power has been in those urban centers by catering to people who talk about things like the tertiary economy. They talk about high tech and the film industry and tourism, right? So you had this real rip in the NDP back then. And because the urban areas were where the main seats were, the NDP actually lost their voice in the rural areas. The MLAs who tried to speak to that were shouted down by their own caucus members. And that's why you get the strength of the BC Liberals and the Conservatives in these areas where they're saying, well, hang on, another mill just shut down, or, here's a mine that has the best environmental standards in the world. And when it comes to LNG, Rich would say, and I would agree with it, that it was Christy Clark pulling forward a file that the bureaucrats had advocated under Gordon Campbell, but he didn't want to talk about it. Again, the urban focus versus the rural focus. Christy Clark, I think, spent enough time in the countryside, and she was from Burnaby. She wasn't really from that sort of downtown core, that she would listen to them. And then Rich ran with it in a huge way. And we got the largest private sector investment in Canadian history. And again, in the last election, we heard the Green Party actually being angry that the NDP, who campaigned against LNG when Christy Clark was premier, now have almost 7 different final investment decisions. Well, those are all from the BC Liberals, and they will generate I would argue, in my perspective, based on the research I've done, some of the cleanest energy in the world with the best labor standards, the highest environmental standards, and they will generate enormous wealth for British Columbia. So I kind of hope that we get a business-minded government in place, because the BC Liberals were going to take a big chunk of that and put it into a legacy fund, similar to how we look at Alberta, although Alberta has their oil sands / tar sands, depending on which side of the ideology you are, but they've made good use of that money. And that was what we were going to do better in BC. That, it may be that that vision will eventually happen. I don't know who will be in government. The election cycle of 4 years on a 10-year plan can be really brutal, really brutal.
Judy, another regular guest in the Rumble Room is former MLA Sheila Orr.
Oh, yes.
Just like you, she's a big-time federal Liberal and often sat on the opposite side of issues from Rich Coleman, at least the public Rich Coleman. She has said some very flattering things about him when you interviewed her for your book. Is it therefore fair to say that Rich is very strong and deliberate in his beliefs, but not necessarily dogmatic, as many folks think he might be?
No, I think he's pretty dogmatic. I think that his application of dogma in priorities is people first. And the thing that Rich and I have in common, which people may or may not know, is we're both practicing Catholics. Now, I'm practicing Catholic from Calcutta, so it's kind of this sort of Eastern perspective on Catholicism, but he's very, very community oriented Catholic, which means the service groups, giving back to the community. So when Sheila Orr is all heart, as I'm sure you know, and so when she would advocate passionately for the whether it's the social justice issues and people who needed a hand, that was his wheelhouse. So it wasn't for him, well, I'm a conservative and you're a liberal. It's like people need something, you want to get it for them. And they would talk about how to accommodate it within the framework of the BC Liberal mandate, which is fiscal responsibility while taking care of people, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's what made him very effective, is that he wants to show up for the people first.
And he was also very generous to other candidates who maybe weren't in generous ridings. I know because he raised so much money. In your book, you talked about Sheila Orr being grateful that he was there to help with financial support while she was fighting in a riding that was not a traditional liberal stronghold.
Exactly. And I mean, that's what, going back to what I said earlier, he was the most successful fundraiser in BC history. And he felt, look, we're all on the same team. So as a team member, you need money, I'll raise money. He did that for many, many candidates. And, politics is a funny place because it doesn't matter how much he showed up for other people. Once they weren't in government again, a lot of people wouldn't even call him back. And that you hear that from politicians all the time. When they're in a position of power, everyone's their friend. And he's a very much, to this day, he's a very generous person who keeps showing up for people. And
You,
so I'm glad that that the book has outlined some of his legacy. And I really hope that in the future, when young people start to re-engage, that my books will give them that perspective on democracy and how you can get things done, and how you can do things from a position of integrity, maybe communicate a little bit better.
it's interesting as an author, and I did just finish reading your book. I can really hear your voice in the way you write. So it's
Oh,
kind of
good.
fun. Some people, when they write, it sounds very analytical, almost something written in a university class.
Yeah.
Yours is very conversational. I found the style very conversational, and I could hear you talking. And I just want to say the book ends in 2023. Rich Coleman retires and goes off to his happy life in the Fraser Valley, although he still is very active in terms of giving advice to various politicians. But
Right.
what about Judy Tyabji? She's finished this book, apparently finished this cycle.
I'm
She's running
sorry
out of
that there's something wrong with the connection. I can't hear you.
running out of premiers. She's running out of premiers to write about. So, I mean,
No,
but
yeah.
she's
Oh,
stated,
there's
she
a
has
but here,
stated
Judy.
for the record what a strong federal liberal she is. Well, hey, I know
Oh my
this
gosh.
liberal fellow, this guy named Justin Trudeau seems to be misunderstood,
Yeah.
particularly in the West. Maybe that would be a good
Oh,
book suggestion, Judy,
I
for
would
the future.
absolutely love to write a book about Justin Trudeau, truly, because I think that he is someone who is way too managed by people with university degrees. And I think he's got more common sense than all of them put together, but he defers to them because he thinks, oh, well, they're the educated ones. I'd love to write a book about him. I'll put it out to the universe. But I think I'm done with BC political books. I've got, a project in the Okanagan. Don't you shake your head.
No.
I mean, I could see it. I could see a time in the future. When I was very young, I thought I would get into politics in my 60s. And I have something I'm working on right now that'll keep me busy for the next few years. And I don't see any doors open right now. The politics is a mess. I'd like to do my part as a citizen to keep the conversation constructive, to help people I think are in it for the right reasons, to write books like I have. But I think I've done my bit on the books, wrap that up with a bow, focus on business for a while. I'm going to be 60 in a couple months. I don't know how that
No,
happened.
no.
But, I know we all get there if we're lucky. But the years just fly on by. And I'm just happy to be close to my kids and my grandkids now.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Well
been
done.
You
pretty.
say when you're, many years ago when you were very young, you don't seem to have aged at all, Judy. And it's been great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, you guys. That was a lot of fun.
You gotta love Judy Tyabji.
Love Judy.
She is, I remember when she first got elected, and she's just kept the ball rolling ever since, and lots of things to say. And we'll have Judy back for sure in the upcoming year in 2025, because there's
Can't
so
believe
much
it.
to talk about on so many fronts, and Judy always has an opinion.
Yeah.
And a couple of items, John. These are more serious things to talk about before we go. First of all, we want to reach out and comment about Grace Lohr. Of course, she was the MLA who was victorious in Victoria Beacon Hill, a cabinet minister, and she has announced that she is now receiving cancer treatment and is stepping back from some of her responsibilities. And we want to be very clear that we are concerned for Grace Lohr. We wish her all the best, and it's a terrible thing to have to face these terrible challenges. I hope she's getting lots of support from her friends and her family and her colleagues, and hope she gets well soon. And also coming up, John, we have the big memorial in the Western communities for the former Premier who has just passed, John Horgan, and that's taking place, an opportunity for the public to come out and really honor someone who's done so much good work over a number of decades, and of course as Premier of the province. And I know you have some thoughts about John Horgan.
Yeah, I sure do. And the context being that I was the economic development officer for the city of Langford, working under Mayor Stu Young for about 2 years. Langford is in the middle of John Horgan's riding, Wanda Fuca something. But I therefore had occasion to work with him, to get to know him, to talk to him. And there are a couple of things that stand out that I'd like to talk about that made him an effective politician. And I think that is rare these days, to have somebody characterized as an effective politician. Whether you're red, right, green, rhino, if you're good at your job, then we all benefit, don't we? Okay, so the first thing, he was so personable. Like, he was easy to get along with. You might even have noticed that, Robin, in your days as a legislative reporter, or you know,
You could always get a comment from him, John. You could always get a comment from
right?
John Horgan.
He was
Oh,
just
absolutely.
like, you could chat with him, you could talk to him, you felt at ease with him. That's rare to say about politicians, especially a premier. Secondly, and I think something that we consistently push and promote on our shows, is he understood the role of the private sector. He understood the role of business. It has to be vibrant for your community to succeed. He got that. Okay, so there were a couple of reasons that made him a very effective politician, and it's too bad and very sad that he's no longer amongst us and no longer impacting policy.
And I suspect we'll see a lot of public buildings named after John Horgan, maybe even the new campus for the university that's going up in Langford, in many ways because of John Horgan and what he's pushed through.
Right.
And he'll be long remembered and long honored, and hats off to John Horgan and the work that he did.
Yeah.
And on that note, John, it's time to wrap the Rumble Room. Perhaps you could again just quickly tell people how they can follow our show and be part of the Rumble Room family.
Yeah, there's so many ways, and we are certainly consolidating all of these different sites. They will all be under one brand, and we look forward to that in the new year. And we will tell you all about that in the new year. But until then, please continue to follow us on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. Man, we're up to over 400 collective shows and clips on our YouTube site. So over the Christmas holidays, you folks have a lot to do. We're also on what we considered at some point peripheral sites. They're no longer peripheral sites. Instagram, TikTok, on audio podcasts. This is how people get their news now. We are on those, and we will also be consolidating our brand. Robin, so great to have you back, my friend. That must have been great. Hear offline what you did when you were down there. I'm looking forward to our Christmas show next week. And who knows? Maybe Santa Claus might be showing up. Oh my. But until then, I certainly wish everyone a Merry Christmas as we prepare for the holidays.
And John, I know you have the looks that you could pull off Santa. There's no two ways about that. And I'll be off madly Christmas shopping this week. And while I'm doing that, I will also be rumbling on.